Hello everyone. This is your professor, Danny Araneta Cabulay, for the course Accounting Information System. Last meeting, we had an online class. This week, we're going to have video lectures on YouTube. So you need to watch 5 video lectures this week. This is the first one. So this is video lecture number 1. So make sure that you watch the entirety of the video and then answer the recitation or pop quiz question at the end. You must place your answer in the comment section in YouTube within 5 days. So for this week, we're going to tackle first Chapter 2. We're done with Chapter 1. We finished that last meeting. So for now, we will talk about Introduction to Transaction Processing. So the learning objectives for this module, at the end of the topic, you, the students, should be able to understand the broad objectives of transaction cycles. You should be able to recognize the types of transactions processed by each of the 3 transaction cycles. Know the basic accounting records used in the TPS, and then understand the relationship between the traditional accounting records and their magnetic equivalents. Be familiar with documentation techniques. Understand the differences between real-time and batch processing and the impact of these technologies on transaction processing. And finally, be familiar with data coding schemes using accounting information system. Now, let us try to define some terms. What is a financial transaction? We learned this already in Chapter 1, but let us review it once again. A financial transaction is an economic event that affects the assets and equities of the firm and is reflected in its accounts and is measured in monetary terms. 2 things are important, yung pag-aari at saka kapital o puhunan ng isang kumpanya, ayan naka-record yan sa ating libro. Pangalawa, yan ay may halaga, may amount. There is a monetary value. In the Philippines, it's expressed in peso terms. Now, that means similar types of transactions are grouped together into 3 transaction cycles: the expenditure cycle, the conversion cycle, and the revenue cycle. These 3 cycles are different from one another. So pag sinabi nating expenditure cycle, paano ba tayo gumagasta? Saan tayo gumagasta? Pangalawa, yung ginasta natin, pinamimili natin ng mga inventaryo, pinapapasahod sa mga tao, at pinambabayad sa renta sa factory o sa opisina. Then, those are the things that we need. Those are what you call the factors of production. How do we convert all of this to come up with a finished product or service? That's what you call the conversion cycle. And finally, once we've converted the product from raw materials to finished goods, or from concept to a service, completed service, then it becomes sellable. May bebenta na natin yung mga produkto at services na yan. Yan ay tatawagin natin na revenue cycle. So customers can either pay in cash or maybe on credit. So that is the relationship of the 3 cycles. Okay? The expenditure cycle, the conversion cycle, and the revenue cycle. Well, each cycle basically has 2 primary subsystems. The expenditure cycle has the physical component. That's when you acquire the goods. Bumibili tayo ng mga gamit, bumibili tayo ng inventaryo. And the financial component, magkano ang binabayad natin sa supplier. The conversion cycle, on the other hand, has 2 components also, or subsystems. Production system, paano tayo nagpo-produce ng mga bagay-bagay, ng mga produkto. Pinaplano natin yan. Ini-schedule natin kailan natin isasalang sa factory. At kinokontrol natin yung physical na produkto sa pamamagitan ng isang factory process. Okay? Now, the second subsystem under conversion cycle would be cost accounting system. So that monitors the flow of cost to production. Like, how much are you going to charge to production for the materials, labor, and overhead that you incur? And finally, the revenue cycle has 2 primary subsystems also, physical component and the financial component. Paano ba umu-order ang customers or client ng ating mga produkto o services? That is the physical component. Then the financial component is when do they pay? How do they pay us? Okay? Now, if you're using manual accounting system records, there are things you need to remember. Source documents, product documents, and turnaround documents. What are source documents? They are used to capture and formalize transaction data needed for transaction processing. Product documents, the result of the transaction processing. Turnaround documents, a product document of one system that becomes the source document of another system. For example, bumili tayo ng inventaryo sa isang vendor. So we receive the goods and then we're given the official receipt because we paid for them. Those documents, the delivery receipt, the invoice, and the official receipt will be used later on for costing the finished product of the factory. So it becomes a source document of another subsystem. So yung ginamit natin, yung resulta ng ating transaction sa expenditure cycle, magagamit natin siya as a source document for the conversion cycle. Okay? Now, other documents we need to remember are journals and ledgers. We studied this in a previous subject. Journal is a record of chronological entry. Remember, the father of double entry bookkeeping is a Venetian monk. His name is Fra Luca Pacioli. So, siya naka-invento niyan way back, many centuries back. Okay? So, there are two types of journals. Special journals, 4 yan, and the general journal. Special journals like cash disbursements journal, cash receipts journal, sales journal, and purchases journal. These are specific classes of transaction that occur in high frequency. Whereas yung mga catch-all or yung mga infrequent, yung mga hindi recurring na mga transactions, hindi magkakapareho, yan pasok lahat sa general journal. Okay? Now, of course, journal is the book of original entry. But all these entries are, all over the place for, let's say, 1 month. You need to classify them. Classify them according to accounts. Lahat ng mga cash transactions, ipasok natin sa ledger account called cash. And then lahat ng mga receivables, accounts receivable transactions, ipasok natin sa account na accounts receivable. So just like your T account, the ledger is the book of financial accounts. That means it resembles the letter T, the T account. You have a debit and a credit, and then ultimately you will end up with a balance. You can have a debit balance if the debits are greater, or a credit balance if the credit amounts are greater at the end of each accounting period. So that's what you call the general ledger and the subsidiary ledger. So the general ledger shows activity for each account listed on the chart of accounts, whereas a subsidiary ledger shows activity by detail for each account type. So every account that you have, meron tayo, for example, accounts receivable, no? So meron tayong subsidiary ledger for that. Okay? Now, a subsidiary ledger, accounts receivable, that's your general ledger account. So marami kang pautang, marami kang clients. So every client, meron kang subsidiary ledger account. For example, San Miguel Corporation is one of your clients. So you have a subsidiary account called SMC or San Miguel Corporation. For example, Robinson's Land is one of your clients. So you have another subsidiary account called Robinson's Land. So sa bawat kliyenteng meron ka, yun yung breakdown ng iyong total accounts receivable. Okay? Then, the flow of information from economic event to general ledger, you start with the customers ordering. So you have this flow chart that looks like a top view of a piano. That's a transaction document. Okay? Now, you record that sales order into the sales journal, especially if there is a commitment, and then you post it to the general ledger. Okay? And then, the subsidiary accounts receivable, subsidiary ledger for that particular client, you have to record that also. Then you periodically reconcile your subsidiary ledger and the general ledger. The subsidiary ledger breakdown should total equal to the general ledger totals also. Okay? Now, accounting records in a computer-based system are quite similar but a little bit more sophisticated and faster to process. So, compare the accounts receivable balance in the balance sheet with the master file accounts receivable control account. Then you reconcile the accounts receivable control figure with the accounts receivable subsidiary account total, and then select a sample of updated entries made to accounts in the accounts receivable subsidiary ledger, and trace these two transactions in the sales journal, your archive file. Lastly, from these journals or journal entries, identify source documents from their files and verify it. No? If necessary, confirm these source documents by contacting the customers, so you would know if these are correct amounts or not. Okay? Now, let's look at the audit trail. So the source document onto the journal, then to the general ledger, and then to the financial statement. So that's the flow. So you can audit it in the same manner, but this time you do it the reverse. You start with the financial statements, and then from the different accounts in the financial statements, you go to the general ledger. Then from the general ledger, you investigate further and look up the journal entries, and finally the source document. So remember, the accounting trail is from source document to financial statements, but the audit trail is the reverse, the opposite. Ganun tayo mag-audit. We start with the FS, we end up with the source document. Para masabi natin na verified and fair ang ating amounts sa ating financial statements. Example of tracing an audit trail verifying accounts receivable. Your accounts receivable ledger, general ledger, general ledger, you verify that from the subsidiary ledger, which is the sum of all customers' receivables. Then you look at the physical and financial components, the sales journal and the sales orders shipping notice. And then for the financial component, you look at the cash receipts journal, the deposit slip, and the remittance advice. Okay? Now, but when you talk about computer-based systems, the audit trail is less observable in a computer-based system than traditional manual systems. The data entry and computer programs are the physical trail. The data are stored in magnetic files. So what are computer files? You have a master file, you have a transaction file, a reference file, and an archive file. A master file generally contains account data, example, general ledger and subsidiary file, transaction file, a temporary file containing transactions since the last update. A reference file contains relatively constant information in processing, example, tax tables, customer addresses, no? And the archive file, this contains past transactions for reference purposes. Now, documentation techniques. Documentation in a computer-based environment is necessary for many reasons. 5 common documentation techniques used are entity relationship diagram, data flow diagram, document flow charts, systems flow charts, and program flow charts. Let's look at each one of this. So the entity relationship diagram, or ERD, a documentation technique to represent the relationship between entities in a system. The REA model, resources, events, agents, of ERD is widely used in AIS. The REA uses 3 types of entities: resources, which means cash and raw materials; events, release of raw materials into production process; and the agents, this would be the inventory clerk, the vendor, and the production worker. Now, what are the cardinalities here? They represent the numerical mapping between entities, like one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. For example, a salesperson is assigned one car type. Di ba bawat ahente may kanya-kanyang sasakyan na naka-assign sa kanila, hindi niya pwedeng ipagamit ang kanyang car sa iba pang ahente. Correct? Alam niyo yung mga ahente na pupunta sa mga probinsya, dekotse sila, right? Ahente ng gamot ng mga pharmaceutical companies, yung mga pharma, medrep, for example, they have a car provided by the company. So that's the relationship there. Or customer to a particular order. Okay? That's one place. So that means, hindi pwede isang customer, marami siyang orders. So there's a batch of orders attributed only to one customer. And then vendor supplies inventories. Okay? So yung ating mga binibiling inventaryo, yan ay naka-attribute sa particular vendors. Okay? So the entity to entity. Okay? Now, data flow diagrams or DFD uses symbols to represent the processes, data sources, and data flows of entities in a system. They represent the logical elements of a system, and they do not represent the physical system. They're just concepts. They're just giving us a broad understanding of how transactions flow or how goods flow, for example. So the data flow diagram symbols are, you have an entity name and then the data source name, the process description, which is the direction of data flow. That is represented by the arrow or the arrowhead. Okay? So systems flowcharts illustrate the relationship among processes and the documents that flow between them. They contain more details than data flow diagrams. They clearly depict the separation functions of functions in a system. For example, in slide 21, here are a set of symbols that represent manual procedures. For example, if you see an oval or circle, oval means it's a terminal showing source or destination of documents. End and start. The start of the process and then the end of the process. If you see a symbol that resembles the top view of a piano, that's a source document or a report. Isang dokumento siya. If you see a inverted pyramid, that's file for storing source documents or reports. Okay? So if you see a particular pyramid but cut in the bottom, no, that's like your it's like a four-legged figure, that's a manual operation. Then when you see a rectangle that is slightly slanting, that's accounting records. That could mean journals, registers, logs, or ledgers. Okay, so those are documents where you record your processes. And then the next figure would be calculated batch total. If you see a circle, that's an on-page connector. If you see an arrowhead pointing downwards, that's an off-page connector. And then the next symbol would be description of processes or comments. And then the document flow line is the line with a thin arrowhead, okay? Thin line with an arrowhead, rather. So if you look at the sales department, you begin with customer, then the customer places a customer order, then sales orders are prepared, and then sales orders are processed, okay? In the meantime, you will see now the different flow of transaction across the four departments from the sales department, credit department, warehouse department, and the shipping department, pertaining only to the same company, the same type of transaction. Okay? Now, let's look at systems flowchart. These are used to represent the relationship between the key elements, input sources, programs, and output products of computer systems and depict the type of media being used, maybe paper, magnetic tape, magnetic disk, and terminals. In practice, there's not much difference between the document and system flowchart. Now, the symbol set for representing computer processes, this could mean a hard copy, computer process, then you have a direct access storage device, and then you have the magnetic tape symbol, then you have the terminal input-output device, and the process flow, real-time online connection, and then video display device. Flowchart showing translation of facts 1, 2, and 3 into visual symbols will be translated as shown in the PowerPoint presentation. Now, when you talk about program flowcharts, they illustrate the logic used in programs. So symbols used are the logical process, which is a rectangle, the diamond, that's the decision, and then terminal or start or end of operation, and then the input-output operation. Okay? Flow of logical process is the arrow and the line. Now, here is the recitation pop quiz question number 2. If you were writing a manual of policies and procedures for a company or department, that is payroll, billing, purchasing, sales, or human resources, why is it better to incorporate a flowchart in its policy? Bakit kaya siya importante? Pag gumagawa tayo ng policy para sa isang manual, let's say operations manual or HR manual, bakit importante na merong flowchart? Follow-up question. What could possibly happen if there was no flowchart in a policy? Gumawa ka ng policy on how to receive sales or how to sell a product or how to process a particular document or how to produce a particular product in the factory. May procedure ka pero walang flowchart. What could possibly happen pag walang flowchart? Your answers in the comment section of YouTube, 30 to 50 words only, maybe 2 to 3 sentences within 5 days. Okay? Asahan ko yan. Let's proceed now to video lecture number 2. Bye!